Sounds like the right crowd. And first of all, I would like to say thank you. I bet a lot of you are super tired. It's been probably super amazing 2 days, and I had such a great time here in St. Petersburg. So before we start, I would like to give it up for the amazing people of Holy. So I would appreciate if we do this. Like, it was an amazing event. Thank you. So because you're tired, I'm going to start with a little story. And I'll try to make my best story voice. So, a story about a couple who met and found their way in life. Many stories have been told about this couple. Like their origins in Oahu, one of the 8 major islands of the Hawaiian archipelago. Many moons rose and fell, and shiny rainbows would race to the sky after the tropical rain. Probably the same ones Captain James Cook saw when he first sailed past the island. Their love was bounded by the jungle air and the salty breeze. 2 foreigners in a distant island looking for a sense of purpose. But this is not the story I'm telling you today. The story I'm telling you today is about how this couple, they moved to Hamburg, Germany to pursue a business venture. The couple founded a sustainable clothing label. They both had a passion for sustainability, for style, and fashion. She already had a long history as a seamstress and garment maker. And he was influenced by his grandmother, who was a seamstress too, and used to sew garments to him according to the epoch. From Miami Vice colors, pastel color suits, to neon color streetwear inspired on the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. They bootstrapped their business and needed to launch an online store. Cash was short, and it was very hard to find an affordable agency who could develop an online store for them. Until one day they found a small agency who was willing to develop an online store for a very fair price. At that time, it was development only, so UI design still needed to be done. With little to no knowledge, the man prepared some screens. And surprisingly, the agency liked it a lot. You have to consider that until that moment, that man had nothing to do with the web nor computers. He didn't even have a high school degree, for that matter. One day, the owner of the small agency had this wild idea. Oops. Sorry. He said to the man, "I think front-end development would be something that you like. What about if you invest the next 6 months learning front-end development, and we will accept that as the payment for your online store?" The man knew that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and of course he took it. Okay, the sound came late. That was the time when he had an idea. Anyways. Since then, he never looked back, and he never expected to change his life in such a profound way that programming and web development would be something that he really loves. My name is Mauricio Palma, and that's the story how I became a web developer. I'm co-founder of Wood Like Ocean, where we craft swimwear out of ocean recovery fishing nets. And we like to experiment with the concept of using waste as the main ingredient of our products. I'm also a product engineer at Sinashkara. And by now you might be wondering, okay, that's nice, but why are you telling me this story? Well, I bet a lot of us in this room are self-taught developers, right? By raise of hands, self-taught developers? A few. That's good. And if the web wouldn't have been an open place, then it would have been very, very hard to learn how to develop. And if you are very young and don't remember life before the internet, then I invite you to ask your parents about it. How it was back in the day? It was much harder. And for many of us, has not been only a path for a career that we love. For many of us, has been an opportunity to get out of financial distress, maybe even poverty, an opportunity for a better life. And that is the very nature of the web, an open space for everyone, a place for creativity, invention, and collaboration. Yet, when we don't think about accessibility, we're excluding people and communities. We prevent web content from evolving and growing. It is important to recognize that when we use our own abilities and experiences as a starting point, we are designing and developing applications that exclude people. That is our human nature. We tend to avoid things we don't understand. But like I said, by doing so, we tend to exclude a lot of people. So I would like to welcome you to the talk, and we will be covering some accessibility as a core concern of our application. And we will cover some automation techniques. Ahora, es muy importante tener en consideración que accesibilidad en un proyecto web puede ser muy difícil. That was awkward, right? Now, besides the people I know here who speak Spanish, probably many of you don't understand what I was trying to say or couldn't read the slides. And I want us to try something out. So if you didn't understood what I was saying or couldn't read the slides, I want you to stand up. Please, I know you're tired, but you're going to see the benefit of it. Now take a look around. That's a lot of us. Thank you. You can see it. And if we reflect for a moment about how we felt when I was speaking Spanish and showing unreadable slides, did you felt maybe irritated, anxious, frustrated, maybe even angry? And this is what we do in every single day to about 217 million people with visual impairments. We deny them access to our personal and professional lives. And what if I tell you that exclusion literally hurts? Neuroscientists have found that the body feeling of exclusion, it is the same emotional pain or how the brain processes when we feel body pain. And like I mentioned, there are about 217 million people with severe visual impairments around the globe, 36 million that are blind, and in Europe alone, there are around 30 million people with visual impairments. And the truth is that we as developers, we don't pay much attention to these numbers. This reflects in all those interactions where we exclude people. But how are we supposed to do something or fix something that we don't know? And that's why I would like to cover with you, before we get into the automation part, how people experience the web with visual impairments, to have a better understanding of what is really going on. So blurry vision. When we talk about blurry vision, we talk about the loss of eyesight sharpness. It makes appear objects to be blurry, focused, and hazy. And I can give you some key takeaways that are actually not that hard to implement for that. Number one, publish always all your information and content in your HTML. Use semantic HTML and markup and the appropriate area landmarks. Write screen reader-friendly markup, and provide keyboard navigation. There are different types of visual loss, and they are caused by different severe eye damages or problems, and they affect individuals differently. And by no means I'm saying that's the only way they experience the UIs. When we talk about partial vision loss, we talk about peripheral visual loss, also known as tunnel vision. Some key takeaways here too. Besides the mentioned semantic HTML and screen reader friendly markup, you should always follow a logical layout that supports at least 200% magnification. Central visual loss relates to the loss of detailed vision, which results in having vision remaining on the side. And it is very important because it allows to make very important decisions like distinguishing objects, estimating distances, or recognizing the path ahead. Now, always put form elements in context, meaning buttons, inputs, and notifications together in a logical manner. For action elements in your interface, use a good combination of colors, shapes, and text, and do not rely on color for conveying meaning. Dyslexia is a common learning difficulty that can cause problems with reading, spelling, and writing. It is a complex language problem, and it involves not being able to break down a word into the sounds it makes it, or as well not being able to think about the sounds when you write it down. According to the European Dyslexia Association, every person with dyslexia has the right to access and receive appropriate support and opportunity to achieve full potential in life, education, and professional life, which in my opinion, it is a beautiful statement that should apply to the web in general. And some key takeaways. Align your text to the left and keep the consistent layout. Keep your content short, clear, and simple. Consider producing other kind of materials like video and audio. And let the users change the background of the text. Now, color blindness is a visual impairment where people lose their ability to recognize or distinguish colors. There are many types of color blindness. In this case, we are seeing a protanopia, which is missing the red hues. Then we have deuteranopia, very hard to pronounce, missing the green hues, and tritanopia, which is yellow and blue hues. There is also monochromatism, which is the absence of colors, and the person perceives everything just as shades of gray. So it comes down in not seeing color clearly, getting colors mixed up, or not being able to differentiate between them. And there's one important thing: do not rely on colors to convey on meaning. Now, implementing accessibility for people with disabilities can seem like a significant constraint, but the resulting web application can actually benefit a lot more users. By developing solutions for people with visual impairments, we help people with temporary disabilities. For example, when there's a lot of sunlight or screen glare and bad lighting. And disability is not just a health problem. A disability can mean the inability to interact with your environment. Physical, cognitive, and social exclusion is the result of these mismatched interactions. This is why we talk nowadays about the persona spectrum, covering a range of permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities. A person can be blind, which is permanent, can suffer from cataracts, which is temporary, or even a distracted driver can have a disability. For us developers, it means that we can use technology as a means to come up with solutions that include more people in the applications we are writing today. And you know what? We can put accessibility everywhere, not only in the underlying UI UX, which is a great start, you should do that, but we can propagate accessibility through all of the layers of our software. And it always will start with you, the human aspect of software. We are the first link in the chain. Then we write some features and provide an accessible application. And we will write unit tests because we want to be sure that we are conveying with the standards. Besides, of course, it is always meaningful to write unit tests so that we have the results that we expect from our application. And we can even put it in our pipelines to automate as much as possible in order to deploy these accessible applications. So it is like a sleeping insurance. Now, how many of you are responsible for deployments? By show of hands. Now, do you remember doing a deployment on Friday night? Yeah. And now the whole idea of this talk came to me is one day, one of my working colleagues, she was working on a color contrast chart, and she was manually checking all the AA and AAA color contrasts. She did that by checking every color, one by one, until she found a match. And at the end, she created this beautiful chart and documentation. Don't get me wrong, she did an amazing job. But it actually hit me like a rock. This is really error-prone. And if we would measure it in O notation, then it would make a worst case of n squared, meaning if she has something like 50 colors to check, she would have to do at least 2,500 iterations to find all the color matches for these contrast colors. And this don't only happens manually. I mean, if we do a linear search for it in JavaScript, we will end up with the same worst case. But anyways, that's not the point. And so I wrote this little application called Forward. And when we talk about MVPs, probably that's the MVPs of MVPs, but we will cover how that works. And it is a universal JavaScript application, and I'm using Next, TypeScript, React, and Emotion for styling. And the implementation heavily relies on the guideline 1.4 of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That means that we will provide AA and AAA color combinations. A, AA, and AAA are the 3 levels of conformance defined by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And by following these guidelines, we're able to provide more accessible and usable web content. Excuse me. So a minimum color contrast, which is AA, is achieved with a minimum contrast of 4.5 to 1. An enhanced color contrast, also known as AAA color contrast, is achieved with a contrast ratio of 7 to 1. And there are some exceptions. For example, large-scale text, AA can have a contrast ratio of 3 to 1. For AAA, it has to be 4.5 to 1. And we can roughly define large text as 24 pixels, and 19 pixels bold. Logos and brand names have no minimum contrast requirement. Nevertheless, if you're a brand or a brand manager, I don't think it would make a lot of sense not to have an accessible brand, but that's just my opinion. And interactive UI elements like hidden elements or elements that are pure decoration don't need a color contrast neither. And offering enough color contrast between text and its background allows people with moderate low vision read the content of a website. People with color blindness might perceive contrast in a different way because of deficiencies and how it affects the luminance. And now that we have some key metrics, we will be able to check out how to calculate this color contrast. And this is the calculation I found at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Take a look at it. I will drink some water. So in my opinion, that was kind of a lot of information to digest at once. And that's why we will break it down into smaller steps. We can divide color into two parts, luminance and chromaticity. Luminance is the photometric measure of luminous intensity per unit area of light traveling in a given direction. It is worth taking in consideration that the objects actually don't have any color. Objects reflect light, and color only exists in the minds of the person who perceives it. Relative luminance, what we need for the color calculations, follow this photometric definition of luminance, but with a normalized value of 0 and 1. 0 being the darkest black, white being the lightest white. And to calculate the contrast ratio, the amount of we will use sRGB working space. Why? First of all, sRGB is the standard red, green, and blue. It's a color space which was developed by HP and Microsoft back in 1996. It was later standardized by the Electrotechnical Commission in Geneva. And it was designed to represent colors in the same way in different devices because it has a very small color gamut and it is very easy for devices to almost reproduce the same colors. And it is by far the most color used as sRGB, and it is native to the web. So even CSS colors are under the hood sRGB colors. On the other hand, RGB is very similar to our visual system. We have 3 independent channels for conveying color, which come from different types of cone cells, or 3 different cone cells in the eye. And those are the reasons we will use RGB as our base color space for the calculations. Now, chromaticity defines the quality of color regardless of luminance. And it consists of 2 parameters, hue, or the dominant complementary wavelength, and saturation. In the XYY color space, the lowercase x and y represent chromaticity, which we just mentioned. And the uppercase y represents the luminance. And the number of parameters also follow the same trichromatism, which is the way we perceive color. So we will get into some basic details for this small algorithm, and we will divide each entry by the full intensity of color, in this case 255. We check this value if it's less than 0.03928, and we will crunch some more numbers. Then on the second step, we just need to add the color for each entry resulted from the first operation. And with these 2 steps, we can calculate the luminance of an RGB color. Actually very simple. And with a relative luminance, we can now go ahead and actually calculate the contrast ratio. For the calculation, it is important that the light and dark color are always on the same order. So it has to be always the lightest color divided by the darkest one. And that's pretty much it. That's the 3 steps we need to calculate contrast ratio. So I guess the next step would be for us to process all possible colors in a performant manner and give back all the AA and AAA color combinations. So we want to be agnostic about how we will be analyzing these colors. And remember what I said, accessibility everywhere. So I don't care if it's the server, if it's the client, if it's a build pipeline. It needs to work, it needs to be fast, and it needs to be reliable. And for that, we can always look at quick sort. So we will do a quick sort on the array, which is considered to be a fast sorting algorithm that takes the divide and conquer approach. It is a basic principle used in very complex applications like file search and data compression. JavaScript has a native implementation, but I did one as well. So basically, we're comparing a color entry with a defined pivot. Think about the array. And what we do is we provide the luminance function, which is going to be our check condition for the colors that we want to sort. So we will compare this pivot against the lower and higher entries within a partition function. These are returned again from this partition function. And our pivot divides the array in two halves. And it is usually for a sort algorithm to pick a good pivot. It is essential to have a performing one. But for the sake of this example, we will just choose the middle. So what we're doing is breaking a bigger problem into a smaller problem that are easier to solve. And basically, that's how it works. You have the two bounds, and you check until you found a match, and you will actually swap them in place until you have sorted all of the colors. And that's how a quick sort works. It's not quite done, but we end up with a sorted color array with from luminance, meaning from 0 luminance to 1. Now, to find the colors, the second step we will do is binary search. Now, our array is sorted. We can actually use a binary search to find the first element that fulfills a AA or a AAA color contrast. If you're not familiar with binary search, it is important to take in consideration that the array must be sorted. And the reason for this is that the binary search always assumes that the middle of the array would be the median value. So this is how it works. It compares the target value, which is on the left side, with the middle element in the array. So we check if there's a match, and if the target is greater, then we know that we can eliminate the first half of the array, and we can continue on the second half. And basically, we repeat this process of halving and searching until we have a match. Now, let's elaborate a little bit more about what we will need for the colors. And in our search, I'm including two new constants. And basically, it is a preview value and a next value. They're always next to the middle. And so if we're searching, for example, for a AAA contrast ratio, our target value must be equal or greater than 7. Meaning, if the middle element is greater than 7, and the left side still within the array, then we know we can move to the next condition. And in that case, we will know when we find our ratio, probably the element that is less than 7. So we're looking for this range until we find our number. So we have sorted our color array. We had found a AA and AAA combinations for each color. So basically, that's a lot to read. I'm sorry, you don't need to read it all, but I explained it. So basically, we can create a new entity, a color, an enhanced color that knows all of their AA color combinations and all of their AAA color combinations. And that's pretty much a factory function that will create this object for each element instance. And it is very useful because we can include some color operations on it as well. So basically now we have an object that contains the information for all of their AA and AAA colors. And this reminds me a little bit of a German saying. They say im Griff haben, what it means having control over. And I kind of like that because we're taking control over our colors. And we have this functionality that we can use in many software layers. For example, we could use it directly in the application. For example, if you're working with a React application, you can pass the colors and the appropriate color contrast. Or you can use it on the unit test because you will know exactly what are the values you're looking for. And we have a little demo. And I must warn you, when I got here, I got this idea of this little feature, and I realized that I needed to rewrite some stuff. So I have spent the last 2.5 days in my room rewriting everything, and I finished like just 30 minutes before the talk. So I'm pretty happy about that, and we will give it a try. So basically, we said, for example, if you're working with a designer, there are plugins that can export all the colors as a JSON file. And so it looks something like this. Nothing special, just a JSON containing an array of all possible colors. It has some pretty fancy names. If you work a lot with designers, you will find they're creative about giving names to colors as well. And this is what we will use. So we want to see, we have this color list. You can think about it, it could be the corporate identity of a product you're working on. So we will use that as our entry. So basically, the button is not styled yet. Like I said, I finished it like 1 hour before. So it's not very accessible neither. You can barely read it. But stick with me with the example and not so much with the UI. So we will pick the JSON. We will be doing everything that I'd explained you on the background. And we get a list of all the colors. So at this point, you just see a list with all these CI colors and their names. But under the hood, I already have their AA, their AAA color combinations. So for example, if I say, maybe you're checking with the designer and saying, okay, let's see what I can use with Lucky Point, then you will see all of their matches. You have all the AAA matches with their score, or the AA matches with their score too. And it is very useful because, for example, the Palm Springs Splash don't have any color contrast. So you know that when you have important web content, you cannot use this color. It doesn't have enough contrast within this color palette. And this is pretty much what it does. And so let me get back to the slides. And so it is open, and I'm the only one working in this thing right now, but I have a lot of ideas of what can be done with it. For example, I would like to build an export for the sketch and to actually automate the whole process. So if you're interested, you can play with it, you can break it, you're more invited to give it a try. If you have some questions, you can just come up to me at the end of the talk. And before we go into our Q&A, there are some things I would like to talk to you. And it is about the benefits of accessibility. This is something that I've been asked all the time. And you have to think that designing and developing web solutions with accessibility in mind generate fresh and new opportunities. It gives us the chance to offer utility and elegance in our UIs. And on the other hand, it's a win-win situation. And for all of those wanting more incentives, I can share with you some enlightening facts, like users are willing to spend more money on a website that it is accessible. On the other hand, Europe is becoming more aware about the importance of an open web, about the importance of equality in the web. And for example, in Norway, it is illegal for a website to be inaccessible in the private and public sector. So if you're working in client services, it's going to come the time that you have to really learn accessibility, because it is not anymore a nice to have, it's going to become a legal requirement. And there's one more thing, cost. Especially, you all know your project manager or your product owner always want to have a price, how much time the team's going to need to implement accessibility. And fair enough, it is important. And unfortunately, there is no golden rule that I can give you today about that, but I can give you some insights. It will always depend from project to project and from the requirements that project has. But what I can really tell you is that when you start incorporating accessibility, there is an initial investment. You need to acquire knowledge. You need to establish processes and increase development time. So this 10%, I was too fast. This 10% is just imaginary. I think I even label it like that. Yeah, that's good. So let's say we're doing a new project and our project manager asks us, okay, how much more is going to be to make it accessible? So we say, okay, for these requirements and guidelines we want to implement, let's say it's going to be 10%. It is still better than implemented accessibility in the middle of a project, which is going to factor you at least 100% of the cost I'm telling you. And I'm telling you this from experience. And the worst, in my absolutely horror scenario, which is project is done and suddenly someone comes, oh, we forgot accessibility. It was in the contract. So that's going to be very expensive. So my point here is that, my point here is, forget it. My point is that you better start thinking at the beginning and don't go through the painful process of trying to implement accessibility in the middle and at the end. So always think when you're starting a new project, how can I implement accessibility and create a process for it? So, questions?
This is our questions chairs. You can choose anything. Yeah. So thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really touching. So from the developer perspective, what do you think? Why we don't have like accessibility first mindset? For example, even major frameworks such as React, Angular, or something like that. For all of them, we have accessibility models, but it's just models like third-party components, and you have to spend time to, for example, include it in project, and there is no such thing as accessibility first mindset in some frameworks.
Well, that's a good question, and it's actually nobody to blame, because for me, it had to be an accident in the family, a health issue, that made me realize that I was not being responsible enough with my work, so I had to learn the hard way. So it's not about blaming, it's about really becoming conscious that a lot of people rely on the web for their daily life. People buy groceries, get their bakery when the family visit, and when people are not able to interact with the web pages, then they're completely excluded from the world. So I'm kind of going very vague with it, but I wish that people then get conscious about it and don't learn like me when something bad happens in your life.
So accessibility is not super easy to understand, and there are a lot of standards, there are a lot of things to read, papers. So what do you think? Who for example, in some development team, we have like a JavaScript developer, maybe UX designer, maybe someone who do HTML, CSS. So who must be the person with the knowledge? Because you have to spend time to understand what is accessibility and how to do that correctly.
Well, there are two things to this. In the real world, you usually have like a specialist in it. But in the ideal world, is you would have a process that everyone in the team is able to think about it that way, in a vertical way. So a lot of us are working on agile projects. We are building increments for our products. And for me as a developer, I think it is important that the whole team is leaving these processes, that everyone is able to implement them. And yes, there's a lot of information, but once you have established some processes, it becomes more routine.
So what do you think should be there? Some kind of accessibility courses or maybe accessibility lessons to understand all this information like systematically. So not to read one article about color contrast, another article, it's not really maybe useful to do that.
A good starting point would be which requirements do you have for your feature, or which requirements do you have for your projects, and think already in the design process about inclusion. So it depends. It's right, the web content accessibility guidelines is a huge documentation with a lot of things to implement, and probably you will not implement them all, so it depends. Yes.
But so for example, for the real product, is there any like gold standard for the accessibility? So there are a lot of standards for accessibility, and as you said, it's hard to implement all of them. So is there any list of must and list of like, it would be nice, but?
This is very opinionated. This is not like somewhere written, so it's my opinion. So I think keyboard navigation is a must. A lot of people don't navigate the websites with keyboard. And not only keyboard navigation, like a quirky one, but a really meaningful flow, so that you have a really nice experience. Because at the end of the day, we are writing websites or applications for the user, not for us. And users, most of them are not tech savvy. So you want to make it easy, to make it elegant, and that's exciting too.
What do you think? Can, for example, right now Chrome shows this tray icon when site does not support HTTPS. Should we have like special icon in Chrome or any browsers that this site does not support accessibility?
I heard this question already yesterday. So it would be nice, but I don't think any company would like to have that. So I don't think no one's going to pay for that, and someone has to pay the bills. On the other hand, I guess if we do something like that, it needs to be on the vendor side. And yes, it would be amazing. Then we are pretty much forced to think about accessibility.
About development perspective of the accessibility and all the things, your solution is super cool, but it covers only one aspect of accessibility, color contrast. Do you know maybe there are some other frameworks to cover more aspect of accessibility for your website?
Sure. For static HTML pages, there's something like Pali, which is really good. I think a lot of us nowadays are working, for example, in React applications, hopefully render on the server, and there are React Axe, which works very nicely. It will give you on the log pretty much all the accessibility things that you're not being fulfilling. It will give you a list. And there is a new tool I'm trying called Just Axe. So it's pretty much this Axe core about accessibility, and it allows to use this in our React unit test. So if you're doing something like Enzyme or a React testing tool, you could implement Just Axe and actually configure it with the accessibility things that you need. and you will get during development already a feedback of what you're doing wrong. And if you're strict about it, you can even put it in your pipeline, and you're not able to publish until everything has been fixed. And I think that's really useful, and we need that.
For the person, for example, if there is someone in the audience who just heard about accessibility and want to understand it better, so what is the best place to start? Maybe some site articles or something like that?
Well, it depends the kind of person you are. If you are the one who loves specs, I love specs, then go to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. If it's a little bit too dry for you, then I would recommend to start more with the inclusion design perspective. There is for example, from IBM or IBM called Inclusion Design, and from Airbnb and other lens. This is more of a holistic approach about when I'm building a product, how do I think about including people? So this is very useful too.
So looks like accessibility, it comes with a price. So for example, designers, they provide fully accessible UI, and so may be really inconvenient for other people, for example. So is there any cost that you, for example, match your color contrast map on the site, but it's unreadable bar by anyone, something like that?
Can you repeat the question again?
Actually, it's, yeah, can I ask it after that? Yeah.
Okay.
I will ask another question, yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there any like examples of super cool, accessible, like perfectly accessible sites? Do you know them?
Perfect is, that's a big word. I wouldn't say perfect, but there's a few sites that I like a lot. I'm not related to them in any way, so I'm not doing any commercial here. But the New York Times, they spend a lot of time and effort on accessibility. And I think they're doing it very well, so you should check that out. Then there are other kinds of accessibility applications where more like an app using speech recognition, where people can, if you have a hearing impairment and you're in a group and people are using this app, they are able to follow. So there is something that I always like to talk, because there is this notion, or sometimes I like to compare accessibility with development for all their browsers. You know, like, who cares? So, but it is not that, and it can be very exciting, and we can use the tools we have today to create accessibility, and this is not even necessarily related to the usual UX, UI guidelines that we have. So we're actually using our tools like JavaScript, HTML, CSS to create meaningful solutions to include people.
Okay, and last question, it's a little bit personal, but your story that when you changed your life and become a front-end developer was really touching. So what changed from that time? Have you ever looked back and think, well, it was a bad decision or something?
No. I love it. And so I would assume that I dare to say that I'm a creative person. So I started with the HTML, CSS, got really geeky into it, creating animations with it, complex things. And at some moment I realized, wow, there is much more to development. There are programming paradigms. Then you start thinking about more computer science related topics. And even though I don't have a high school degree, for me it's super, super exciting to learn all these things. And sometimes I wish I could learn even faster or learn faster. I'm not such a fast learner, but it is an incredible field that you can do amazing stuff. So I've been loving it since day one, and it's been already 7 years. So
thank you very much for your talk.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.